Here at the festival, the Institute tries to take on a lot of the most important ideas that society is facing. I would argue that the topic we're going to talk about today has a claim on being at the very top. That if you're going to think about a problem that affects our ability to solve every other problem, this is the one that really has a claim on it, because the breakdown of trust in American society, and as you'll hear, across much of the Western world and Japan, is about the most disturbing macro trend we have going on today. And we're really fortunate to have with us Tom Wilson, who is the CEO and chairman of Allstate, as well as Richard Edelman, who is the president and CEO of Edelman, to talk to us about why this is, what the consequences are, and maybe most importantly, what we can do about it. I'm going to start just by setting the scene a little bit for us. Which is, if you are in business, you probably often go around and have people ask you, why is it that business doesn't receive as much trust and faith from the American people as it used to? If you are in politics, you have people say to you, why doesn't politics live up to the ideals that we used to have about politics? Why don't people believe in politics? I spent last year working on a strategic project to think about what the future of the New York Times should look like. And I can't tell you the number of times I have had people say to me, either, why can't the media be better? Or, I actually think the media is pretty good. Why don't the American people believe what they are hearing from the media? Which is to say, why don't people trust the media? And I would argue that the answers to all these questions cannot be thought about in isolation. You can't try to think about why business isn't trusted, or why politics isn't trusted, or why the media isn't trusted. This cuts across nearly every segment of society. Business, politics, labor, organized religion, media, you name it. Nearly every institution in American society is substantially less trusted than it used to be. There is one exception, the United States military. And I actually hope we can maybe touch on why that may be today. I would argue that the macro explanation for this has to do with the stagnation of living standards, and we'll get into more of that. But I would also invite Tom and Richard to offer their own explanations for why that is. And so as we just think about this decline in trust, Richard, you have some pretty remarkable data and research that talks about it. Can I ask you to kind of pick up from there and go into much more depth than I did about what we're looking at here?
So let me try to give you a long picture on trust. We look at trust in 28 countries, and we've done it for 17 years. We look at trust in NGOs, business, government, and the media. And if you look at over that 17-year period, NGOs have always been the sainted creatures, the ones who do no wrong, but are not exactly trusted to implement. They're good objectors, but they're not good doers. Business is the most episodic and kind of unpredictable. It's related to events. So in 2008, trust in business crashed. But today, business and NGOs are now vying for the highest rank in most countries. Government was fine and actually really strong through 2008, 2009, because it was the institution that bailed everything out. And then came the impasse in Washington, the problems in Brussels over the Greek debt, and then the catastrophic problems in developing markets. So trust in government in some countries is 50 points lower than that of business. The media is the biggest story of this year, which is to say that media has been somewhere between second and third in trust and has collapsed now to fourth place, the least trusted institution in many countries, tied with government. And I'll give a hypothesis on this. Unfortunately, media has now fallen into the category of being seen as part of the elite and doesn't really cover the middle of the country. You've heard a lot of these kinds of claims, and some of the best statistics that I can give you, 15% trust in the media by Trump voters. It's the lowest number we've ever seen, lower than Russia, and that's a staggering number. It's sickening.
Yeah.
But that's the number. And so transversal, if you look at this, there's a mass-class divide, which really started to become evident in 2012. In the United States, it's like 22 points between the view of the people who are in the top percentage of income, high education, and read multiple media sources a day. Also, you actually now have a move beyond lack of trust to a lack of faith in the system. And more than half the people in the United States believe the system is failing, which means, one, that they believe the leadership is poor, two, that the division of resources is unequal, three, they don't believe in the future. They don't think their kids are going to be as well off as they are. And fourth, they want change. And so this is now true in most of the countries of the world. It is spread from a sort of whiny Western Europe to the United States and now into developing markets such as Brazil and Mexico, where they have governmental issues. The only islands of stability on trust tend to be those countries with less than democratic governments. So China, for instance, the UAE, the places where democracy is not even considered. Or countries that are doing really well economically. So India, the Modi phenomenon, also Indonesia's done quite well economically. Holland is the only country in the West that seems the difference maker. And Canada's pretty happy as well because of Justin. I don't know him, it's Trudeau, I should say.
One quick question before I get to Tom. Do you think that in China, people are lying and they feel like they have to say they trust the government, or do you feel like they actually trust the government?
I think that they actually believe that they are better off than they were, and that there's progress in economics. I don't think they love their system.
Yeah. So in some ways, it's a version of the Modi story. It's
yes.
a difference.
Yeah.
So Tom, from your perch, right? Your business is in so many different parts of American life. What do you see as the fundamental explanations for what I would describe as this trust crisis?
I think it's related to what you talked about. You gave the outcome, which is declining living standards. I think people just think we're not doing our job. What is trust? That means I can rely on you, and I can't speak necessarily to the media or religion or politics, but I can speak to business. And I think what business does is it creates prosperity. We know how to take iron and we make skyscrapers, and we take molecules and we make life-saving drugs. Like, we do really good stuff. And we pat ourselves on the back and we say, you just don't know it, like you're not recognizing it. And they say, yeah, I know you're doing that, but there's some other stuff I want you to do. And I think business got hung up on Milton Friedman, who said businesses should do one thing and one thing only, and that's make money for shareholders. I just think that's wrong, and I think that's not what's expected of society. Society wants dignity through work. And if you said, is business, so I go around and ask other CEOs, particularly public company CEOs, at a board meeting, what's the probability that you'll be asked about total shareholder return? 100%, okay, multiple times. How many times will you be asked about, have you created more jobs that provide more dignity in America? The answer is usually, if it's related to the first one, yeah. If you're asking me if that's my purpose, no. That said, I think what has happened is that's what people think the purpose of business is. Like, we're supposed to employ people. And unless we get ourselves organized on broadening our purpose, our trust is just going to keep going down. I mean, trust is just a difference between what I expect and what you do. And what we got is a bigger gap, which is a debt. We're going to have to pay it back at some point.
What year are you in again as CEO?
11.
11. So you obviously have had a very successful tenure. I guess the thing that is tricky here. I think the thing is tricky here that if you went to your board and you were not creating shareholder value and you said, yes, however, I'm doing all these other things to improve society, they would say thank you for your service, right? And so how, as an executive, do you balance the fact that you have a fiduciary duty to increase shareholder value? These other things, I agree with you. It is central that we have corporations playing a role here. But I think it's really tricky to figure out how it happens.
Well, it's like having multiple objectives. You have multiple objectives in your job. So I think businesses should have five reasons to exist. One, got to make money for your shareholders. Like, we get paid to get a return on capital. Got to do that. That's right up there. I think we should provide dignity through work. I think we should come up with sustainable solutions. We shouldn't let society push us to do, short-term fixes. I think we need to make sure there's economic fairness in America, and I think we need to make our communities better. You can do all five of those. Now, do you have to make a little trade-off here or there for one or the other? Sure. But if you say your only goal is to get maximized shareholder return, which is what a lot of activists and other people are after, I just don't think that's right. I was very disappointed, including in myself. So I don't know Paul Pullman from Unilever, but they're a company that stands out there to have multiple objectives, from what I've read. So he gets attacked by an activist, and they make some changes. No one person stood up and said, they do some other really good stuff. And so if the return on equity is 12.5% and not 13%, but look at all the other good stuff they're doing on water and all the other things, like we should be okay with that. Nobody did that, so I think we have to change the dialogue.
Yeah. Richard, you were going to come in.
Well, in two ways. One, Unilever's our largest client, so I know something and on this. And the important point. No, I will. But the important point to make is 200 NGOs wrote notes. Also, the government of the UK and Holland basically said to the Kraft Heinz folks, this is going to be a nice, long process. We're going to have lots of approvals. You're going to drag this out for years. So Mr. Buffett started to get a little nervous about that one. And I think Unilever's model is actually a question of, will business be able to do things the right way? Because, his sustainable living plan is to double revenue and keep the consumption of resources flat. And that's a big aspiration. Mm-hmm. And he said that he's done the easy 1/3, which is to fix his supply chain, which is to fix the packaging and all that. The hardest 2/3 is to fix consumer behavior and to get them to accept cold water wash, shorter showers, et cetera. That's a matter of beliefs. And that's where I think business is going to have to go in the next phase. To address people's beliefs. If brands are smart, they're going to understand that the next phase is that consumers are going to somehow absorb purpose. And that's why upstart brands like Chobani have made such advances, because they have a story, and they have a mission, and they have a purpose. And I'm just curious how many of you eat Chobani? Okay, well, and you know about the story of Hamdi Ulukaya and his decency in hiring immigrants like him who came over here, and there are Syrians working north of here in Idaho who had no jobs. And he said, I want these people working for me.
I mean, I think that I completely agree with you on customers will buy from you because of who you are, not just what you sell. And I think it's great that NGOs did that, but in my world, money talks. And the rest walks. And until we get the moneyed class to stand up and say to Unilever, that's okay, he's going to be walking into a headwind.
So I just think that we've had like 4 waves of the tsunami, and the first wave was the huge one, which was 2008, where I think the public was basically feeling betrayed by business, that somehow the excesses of Citigroup and GM and all these companies having to be bailed out by the government, and a lot of people lost their homes. 13 million Americans lost their homes in the mortgage crisis. And I think that weakened the system. And then on top of that, you've had the losses of jobs to globalization and much more to automation. 4 out of 5 jobs lost are to automation. And then now this latest thing, which is lack of belief in the media. Where do you go for information? Well, you go to your friends and family. The number one source of information is peers. The second is employees. The lowest is CEOs and government officials. And the media is hurt by this because the sense is somehow, you're the elites. And I think it is something you have to fight back against, which you are doing.
Oh, and to do a little cross-panel advertising, at 8:30 tonight at the Jerome, we'll be talking about the future of media. And I think one of the things that's so difficult is the media has now, look, the President of the United States has called the media the enemy of the people, right? And so this is something, the media has become a real partisan symbol. And we're not on a media panel now. I'm happy to talk at length about the shortcomings of the media. But it's very hard to imagine that any particular small fixes are going to overcome the partisanship of the media.
But David, the biggest statistic people have to take from this room is 4 out of 5 people read only that which they agree with. Yep. This is a new phenomenon. And on top of that, they prefer search to human editors. And search simply reinforces your bubble. And worse, they actually now communicate horizontally, peer-to-peer, information that may not be true. It just happens to suit their purpose. And so it becomes a circle of bad.
The concern I have about the whole thing is that, trust, you rely on somebody, and if you don't trust somebody and you can't count on your future, you get afraid. And when we're afraid, we don't act. We get defensive. We take fewer risks. And this is at a time when we're going through a period of massive change in America. in the world for that matter. And if we don't trust each other, there's great opportunity. So I was talking to Bob Steele earlier. I'm like, there is so much opportunity for us to make the world better in front of us, but we got to trust each other. And if we don't go into this with a high level of trust, it won't work. And so we had this guy come speak to us from Northwestern, Rob Wolcott, professor, and he said, the amount of change you experienced in the last month is the least amount of change you'll experience in every month for the rest of your life. And I was like totally bummed out. I was like, I could have used like a weekend off, like I'm still trying to figure out, how to get the apps to work, I couldn't get the, so, but the point is the pace of change is going up, right? And as the change comes, if we don't have institutions we can trust in, whether it's the media, religion, politicians, business, we are never going to embrace a change. And so we're going to have things like free trade and other things that people just dump on, which will not enable us to take advantage of this great opportunity in front of us.
No, I think if you look at the possibilities out there in terms of medical research, in terms of technology, honestly, in terms of discrimination, I do not at all want to suggest that discrimination is gone, but you think about over the last generation, what has happened to discrimination on religious grounds, on sexual orientation grounds, in terms of race relations, all kinds of things. There's so much opportunity for society to get better, and yet there's also this fundamental stagnation that I think not only has damaged a lot of people, but creates this fear. I think your point about fear is really central here. If you think about how many generations came to this country and essentially got to enjoy higher living standards than their parents or grandparents, that creates the opposite of fear, right? That means, hey, I sacrificed, and on a fundamental level, it worked out. I would guess we all have that story, right? I came across a ship's manifest of my grandfather coming to this country, escaping the Nazis, and he listed his profession, and it was journalist. I never thought about my grandfather as being a journalist. I thought about him as owning a small commercial photography business in the middle of New York. He had been a journalist. He had to flee the Nazis. He never got to be a journalist again. And I get to be a journalist, right? And so I think about that story, and to me, it makes me willing to sacrifice for my own kids. It makes me willing to have faith that things will work out. And then you take the flip side, and I just want to read you a couple of quick statistics, because I think they really are the backdrop to all this. And then we're going to move to the consequences of the trust gap. The typical American household has a net worth that is 14% lower than the typical household did in 1984. The life expectancy gap between the affluent and everyone else is growing. In fact, for some groups of non-college graduates, life expectancy has declined. The number of children living with one parent or no parents has doubled since the 1970s. The obesity rate has tripled since the 1970s. About 8 million people have spent time behind bars at some point in their life, up from only 1.5 million people 40 years ago. You could go through lots and lots of statistics like this, and what basically happened is we had decades of pretty slow growth in living standards, and then as Richard said, we had this tsunami of the crisis, which made all these trends even darker. And so that brings us to the consequences question, right? So what does it mean that we are living in a society in which trust is broken down on so many levels? How does that affect our ability in a very tangible way for society to function? Richard?
So I think what's going on, let me start with marketing. I think that people are going local. They're going small. They're going organic. They're
Call your Allstate agency. Sorry. Sorry, low advertisement.
That's good. They're entrepreneurs. And I think also there's a aspect of deep fear of innovation. By 2 to 1, people are afraid of the pace of change. And that's partly because the sharing economy now has 30 million jobs and more or less not much of a social safety net underneath that. On top of it, people who are in the trucking business, for example, there are 3 million truck drivers in the United States. They read about autonomous vehicles coming in the next decade. What are these people going to do? The question is whether business is going to take on the job of retraining the UPS driver or just leave it to government. And I think basically people have absorbed that government is unable, incapable, and frozen at the moment. Therefore, they're going to be left to fend for themselves. And so either business steps up and does what it should do, which is to retrain these people for the next job and improve the education system so we get to that next level, or we're going to really have a bigger problem than we have now. Populism under Trump is just one level. I mean, I just give you statistics from the UK, from France. We just came out of the field like last month. The numbers, even from November to May, went down by from mid-30s to mid-20s in both those countries.
Which number?
The trust in institutions across all the institutions, media, government, business, et cetera, is now in the 20s in the UK, in the 20s in France. You wonder why Macron wins. Well, it's dissatisfaction. And in Germany, it's staying in the 30s because Merkel's the different one. So it shows that there's a personal leadership aspect.
Yeah. What do you see, Tom, as the consequences?
Well, I think the operating environment which we'll be in will be different for whether it's business and media. I don't know what will happen to media, but I can tell you about business. So I look at that. So if you expect this and you get this, that's a debt. So if people expect businesses to do X and we're not doing it, then there's a deficit. That creates a debt. Eventually, that debt comes due. And so there's a book, and The Sun Also Rises, a Hemingway book. There's a guy who goes broke, Mike, and his friend says to him, how'd you go broke? And he says, gradually, then suddenly. And I think that's how most things happen in life, right? Like, how'd you get divorced? How'd you lose your best friend? Like, gradually, then suddenly. And that's what happens with this debt. We're not going to get a save-the-date card. We're not going to get anything else. Someone's just going to wake up one day, and they're going to say, this is not right. You're not training people. You're not doing it, so you need to do something about it. Because it will change. And let's use free trade as an example. I think so free trade, almost all historians and economists agree that free trade, global trade is good for the economy. Yet and business says, yeah, see, and we keep throwing these facts out there. You should pay attention. And of course, we have all these people who don't want to restrict trade. And you say, well, why is that? I think that's because the costs are spread so broadly across society, nobody notices it. But the benefits are, but the costs are very narrow. So sweatshirt manufacturer gets out of Rhode Island, goes overseas. Sweatshirts are 50 cents cheaper at Target. Who knows? $9, $8.50, nobody pays attention. Shut down the factory, it's on the news, everybody sees it, lost jobs. And so those costs, in the free market doesn't work. The free market doesn't take some of that 50 cents per sweatshirt and allocate it back to these people. Now, if you believe in Adam Smith, who says only do it in your best interest, or Milton Friedman says only make money, you say that's somebody else's problem. Like, I'm going to operate myself. But business needs to say, no, that's our problem. And unless we fix it, pretty soon we won't be able to trade with other people. And you see that happening now. So I think the consequence for whether it's politicians, Richard was just saying, politicians, hey, they're all getting thrown out.
Yeah.
So, don't do your job, the debt comes due. And that's no way to deal with change.
I would often, tell me if you disagree, but I would offer even a sharper version of that, which is, I also agree that global trade is to the enormous benefit of societies. To me, what's happened is not only are the benefits diffuse and the costs highly salient, but actually on net, the benefits from the entire economic growth have been so small for so much of the population that even if it's reduced the cost of a sweatshirt at Target, their wage has also been falling or has been stagnant. And so when you look at the statistics on wage and net worth.
Sense. Yeah, you're adding fuel on the fire.
Yeah.
It's already.
So that in the 80s and 90s when things were better, the dynamic you're talking about was at play. And now we've got this sort of double dynamic at play.
David, I think smart companies are going to absorb the lesson of having to communicate from inside out. What I mean by that is they're going to have to start with their own employee base and persuade them that actually they're going to have a good wage, that they're going to have retraining, that they're going to have a decent pension when they retire, and that they have a good compact with the employees. Because if you believe, as I believe, that the predominant means by which people now communicate is no longer vertical, but is actually horizontal, it means that the media is important, but it's important as it feeds the horizontal conversation. It no longer has the locus or the kind of power to be determinative without the consensus of the horizontal discussion. If that's the case, the employee base is the key to successfully getting to trust. And the employees expect two words, engagement and integrity. If you have those things, you will succeed. If you do not have those things, you are lost. And what does that mean exactly? Tell them what's going on. That's engagement. And integrity is behave properly. You can't do communications out of a problem until you fix the problem. And trust me, I know something about that for clients. That was supposed to be a joke. But it's a laugh line. Walter does them better. I have to learn from you. But anyway, the basic idea of communicating from inside out also is profound, because a lot of companies aren't going to be able to be covered by the media in the future because the media is going to be diminished in size. The business model issues for media are serious. There are less than half as many reporters in daily newsrooms in the newspapers of the United States than there were 10 years ago. 400,000 to 170,000. This is truth.
Yep.
This is not alternative. And that was another small joke. But the consequence of this is there are fewer reporters to tell these stories. Okay, then tell them yourself. Otherwise, demagogues will tell the stories in the way they want to. And so communicate yourself. Let your employees carry your game for you. It's not a top-down world. If the C. Wright Mills theory of the power elite was this pyramid of influence that many of you studied in government class like I did, that C. Wright Mills pyramid is flipped upside down, and the power is with the mass. So tell the mass what's going on and let them communicate with each other. That's who they believe. They do not believe the big boss. And I'll tell you one other small thing. If it's going to be a big boss, you better be short form, you better tell stories, and you better be quick about it. This is the success of Trump. I don't like what he does, but I'm telling you the style suits the moment.
I'll offer one silver lining on the media story. I work for a newspaper. I lament I mourn the decline of newspapers, and I think in local newspapers it's actually a real problem for democracy. But we have at the same time had this rise of new kinds of media.
True.
Some of which are not good, but many of which are actually really quite strong.
Yep.
Richard, can you just give us a super brief tour of the world? We were talking about this before we came up. And so I gave kind of a tour of the statistics here in this country about how living standards have stagnated. Take us through the world and just remind us of all the earthquakes we've had over the last couple of years.
So let's start with Japan. Japan was about the fourth most trusting country in the world until Fukushima. And when Fukushima happened, you had a failure of government, you had a failure of media, you certainly had a failure of business, and you had a failure of NGOs. In other words, the local NGOs didn't really tell the story of how bad this was for people to stay in the locality. And so Japan plummeted to Russia levels and has stayed there, gradually, grudgingly coming up instead of 28th, I think they're 26th now. So if you have a big trust issue, it's a long time coming back. Let's go further. Korea, Brazil. Korea has always had big antipathy to companies because they have chaebols, which are these giant companies, 6 or 8 of them, and the economy is very controlled by chaebols. They've disliked business, but now they dislike government because of Mrs. Park. And she's been deposed, and now there's a more sort of left person in. But that's a big story. Brazil, after Dilma's reelection, was the most trusting country in the world, and now is in the bottom 4 or 5. So a huge fall from grace because of Lava Jato, which is a car wash, which is uncovering more and more corruption every day, including huge corporations bribing congressionals. And including yesterday, you guys had the piece about Mr. Timmer, the president having gotten a $150,000 bribe from the meatpacking company for a big loan. Anyway, story of Brazil goes on. The best stories that I can tell you so that you have some hope and optimism of rising trust in some countries. If you have positive economic development like India, India's risen straight up the charts in the last 5 years. That's a good story. Indonesia's a good story. Canada's a good story. Holland's a good story. Here's an important point. For trust to generally rise, both business and government have to be solid. Can't be one or the other. Can't be like a seesaw. It has to be working together. It can't be adversarial. And you can't have big problems like Fukushima.
So you just think about that list: Fukushima, Brazil, Korea, Brexit, Macron, Trump. Whatever your politics, it's just again and again and again we see this instability in politics that comes from this.
Well, I mean, I think that the British election was completely fascinating because the Brexit election, the elites all were self-persuaded. I'm sure all your friends, we got this, no problem. Obama went over, it's going to be important for the world. It was exactly the wrong thing, actually, to have the President of the United States go and tell people in Britain how to vote. Right. And the older people voted like crazy for Brexit. The younger people didn't vote. Now, in this most recent election, the younger people voted, and they voted for Corbyn, who's bringing back ideas from the 70s about, nationalizing, various parts of the system, and everybody gets a free college education. What the heck? It's only $8 billion a year. Okay, but Britain's in a real fix. Britain is now sort of in the bottom quarter of our countries.
We're going to talk about solutions now, but I just stumbled on an unbelievable statistics about voter turnout in this country. In the last midterm election we had, 2014, 17% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 24 voted.
Pathetic.
17%.
Yeah.
So solutions. Tom, from your perch, what would you like to see government do in a broad sense? I don't mean a set of bills, but what do you, as the CEO of a company, want from American government?
Well, what I want from government is, I think, what I want from business and what I want from the media and everybody else, which is to, one, accept it and not live with our heads in the sand. If you look at any of these polls, about 3/4 of the people, we all fight over whether you're 20%, 30%. If you got 3/4 of the people saying they don't trust you,
Right.
It doesn't really matter.
Right.
And so we're all in the same soup. And so I don't think it's just government's problem. I don't think it's just business' problem. I think it's everybody's problem. And I think it's all of us need to, as leaders, because everybody in this room is a leader in some way, shape, or form, is recognize that we've lost some leadership mantle of trust. And my sense is one of the reasons is because we need to listen more, we need to understand, we need to respect, and then we need to act. So a lot of times when I'm talking to people in the business community about trust and our reputation, they say, well, let's do an advertising program. I'm like, I don't think it's going to make any difference. So we tell them we're supporting all these NGOs and all kinds of stuff. They don't really care. What they care is what happens day to day and the bill they get and whether they have a job. So, we can advertise our hearts out and we'll just make the media rich. What we need to do is figure out how to act differently. But to act differently, that means we have to really listen, understand, and respect. And what I see happening in America today is people are not listening to the other sides. They certainly are not trying to understand them. And they don't respect them. And so you can look at both sides of the equation on for Trump and against Trump. And they're on all sides, and there's a lack of respect, certainly lack of understanding. And the best you can get is acquiescence and avoidance. Just not going to talk about politics at dinner anymore with that person because it just gets too tough, it's just emotionally too draining. I'm like, well, that's not a way to go forward. That's a way to stay where you're at and not make any progress. But unless we all decide, business has to listen to our employees. And when they say, I'm worried I'm not going to have a job. We're right now trying to figure, we just asked our HR department to think about creating a group that is job creation and transition. So we just let go 835 claim adjusters because we can do it on the phone without paying people to drive around. So had I thought about it, now in normal stages, we could absorb those people. The pace of change was okay. 10 years ago, we closed offices, moved around, we moved people around. We was called bucking a truck. You gave them some money to move, and they went someplace else. And it all worked fine. Today, it's coming so fast, I'm like, we got to get ahead of it. I should have been thinking about this 3 years ago. So how do we have to listen to them. We have to then try to understand what they're really feeling. And we do have to act. If we don't act, we're just going to keep getting what we got.
I mean, Richard, when I think about what you were talking about, Modi, it seems to me that as we listen to people and as we continue to have open minds and conversations, I would argue that we should remain laser focused on this idea of rising living standards. Because when you look at where the places are around the world that still have not only solid trust but rising trust, that seems to be the common denominator. And so that as we listen and retain an open mind, that's sort of the goal to get to. Does that feel right to you, Richard?
So what's coming like a steamroller is automation. And it's partly a function of the sharing economy. It's partly a function of cost control and making your numbers. And I don't think business has explicitly taken on the responsibility of what to do with the existing workforce. And it's a moment in time when the technology industry can actually be the leaders. They have been the leaders in trust for as long as we've done our study. But they are absolutely stubborn on the, not my problem, we do the machines, other people buy them. I think that's not good enough. I actually think the tech industry has to be part of the, particularly the solution for the sharing economy. Because unless, and I think Senator Warner is speaking here later this week on this topic, and you should go hear him. But he has a really good proposal about how some of the profits from sharing economy should be channeled into some sort of social safety net. This is just sitting here as an issue that's going to be coming, and again, can be demagogued by populists. Again, Walter knows the Huey Long story, but we don't need Huey Longs in America. We've seen this play before. We need to be smart enough to play 2 chess moves ahead here.
Well, I agree with raising living standards. I think that's, people want to live fulfilled lives. You could decide what's in standards. Some of it's economic, some of it's ability to be with your family, not have to work all, there's
health.
Yeah,
yep.
Right. And I agree with all the standards you put out there. But I would say that part of the problem is government, business, NGOs. NGOs not so much. They seem to be, because they're mostly in revenue hunt, seem to get along more with people. But we're not listening to each other. So like I don't remember exactly what your quote was for Donald Trump about media, but I still remember fat cat bankers. Okay, I can tell you exactly when that was said. I know most people in financial services remember when President Obama said that, and it's still sticking with me. So, I don't feel respected by the government. Like, I'm just, as a business person, I don't feel like you're walking in the government. You feel like you're not trusted. You feel like, you're trying to figure out how you're going to do something against them. I probably feel the same way about politicians. So maybe what we need to do first, I hadn't thought about it till you brought it up. I'm like, maybe we need to listen to each other and say, there's some really good government officials. There's some really good politicians. They're trying to do good stuff. I think Mark Warner's a good senator. He's trying to do I think he should take money from somebody and redirect somebody else? I'm like, no, the Soviet Union failed. We gave up on centralized economies. But I could have an open debate with him, and I should respect his point of view. And if he decides, then I should understand it. But I think we have this breakdown, not only lack of trust here, we have lack of trust between the different pillars of society.
But David, I think Tom's actually done something in Chicago that you should know about, which is Get in Chicago. You know about gun violence in Chicago. He and I guess 5 or 10 other CEOs said, okay, what are we going to do about this? We're going to set up a fund that business is going to give to very qualified person to distribute to try things on the ground in the affected communities, social services, things that government can't support until they scale. Well, that's an entirely reasonable response, and I also think it's smart that it's local. It's done at city level. It's done with mayors because they can be flexible. And you didn't actually run it through the mayor. You set it up. You should talk about it.
Well, we're trying to make a difference, but the part about local I think is really interesting. Yeah. Trust. When you look at all the trust numbers, the closer somebody is to an organization, the more they trust them.
Yeah.
People work for us. They trust us more than they trust business in total.
The classic, people like their teacher, they like their school, they think the education system is broken.
They hate the education system, yeah. And so I think there's something there we could build on, like how do you make it more local? How do you step out and drive it? So I think we could come together. But I think it's also, you just got to take some risk and do it.
And also, I think you have to stand up to government. When government overreaches, as in the immigration by the president, the tech company said, no, this is not going to work for us. And the H-1B people, they matter for us. They're the lifeblood of our tech engineers workforce. And so they backed off.
We're going to open it up to you all in one minute. But first, since we've agreed about so much, I want to push you on one thing, which is, I think the fat cat bankers line by President Obama was a mistake. I bet he thinks it's a mistake. But let me turn it around a little bit and ask, are we also too sensitive? Fat cat bankers was much less harsh than many things that Teddy Roosevelt said, right? Malefactors of great wealth. much less harsh than many things that FDR said about business. And so is part of it, in addition to listening to each other, maybe just letting it go when someone says something that they shouldn't have said? Fat Cat Bankers is stuck with business people for so long about Obama, and yet when I look historically, it really doesn't match the level of negativity that some previous presidents said.
Well, and I would say, for the most part, doesn't match with what the Obama administration did.
Right.
So I actually thought they were fairly balanced in the way they dealt with business. But maybe it gets back to that respect thing. You know, maybe like it resonates so negatively with business because we don't feel respected. Maybe because you think Donald Trump doesn't respect media, it'll, 10 years from now, you'll be sitting here saying, you remember when Trump said X. We are probably too sensitive. But I would also say, in today's media world, and you both know this better than I, this stuff gets magnitude, man. It goes viral. You can have, some dope from no place say something bad about you, and suddenly, 50,000 people see it, and then you got board members calling you, and you got media people calling, and you're like, just because this person had a computer and access to the internet, why are we paying attention? So in my world, it just seems like there's a lot more of that stuff to deal with. I would probably argue in Teddy Roosevelt's days, he might have said it, and nobody paid attention.
No one tweeted it.
Yeah, nobody tweeted it.
Yeah, no, that actually makes a lot of sense. The funny thing about Trump is, obviously, on some level, he doesn't respect media, right? He blasts them. On the other hand, the guy reads his print newspapers every day. He's famous for when he doesn't like an article, scrawling a little note on it and sending it to the journalist, right? On the other hand, on some basic level, he respects media more deeply and cares about media more deeply than any president we've ever had.
I don't know if he respects it. I would say he plays you quite well. It's like a Stradivarius violin.
Yeah. No, that's fair.
And he has figured out how to work that system.
No.
Man, I wish I was 1/100th as good as he is.
And so I'm 44 years old. I grew up in New York City. The fascinating, I'm sure we have some other New Yorkers in the audience here. I think much of America thinks of Trump as being made famous by The Apprentice. But in New York, Donald Trump was as famous as it got in the 1980s. And it was all about him playing the tabloids like a Stradivarius. Really kind of amazing, amazing stuff. I want to end on an up note before we turn it to them. Give us a reason to be hopeful. So mine would be, and I can't explain it if we have someone in the audience who does want to explain it, mine would be the US military. If you were at yesterday's session on Vietnam with this upcoming PBS series by Lynn Novick and Ken Burns on Vietnam, you of course remember what the military's reputation was like in much of this country. It was like the media today. It was, you say the military, and one half of the aisle said they're terrible, and the other half said they're great. And today, the military is, I'm not saying it's universal, right? There was some booing at the Democratic Convention this year, but really the mainstream left and nearly all of the right has deep respect for the military. And to me, we should try to look for that for lessons. So however local or global it is, can you all give me one reason that we should be a little bit less head in our hands than the rest of this panel would suggest?
Well, I love your example of how the military turned around. And I think my answer would be freedom and change. We have the freedom to reach into the amount of change coming. The amount of change coming, whether it's in genetics and artificial intelligence, has the opportunity to reshape the world. We're going to figure out how to do it, if you keep people employed and doing that stuff. But there is so much opportunity out there, whether it's in the personal transportation business where we spend a bunch of things. It's incredibly inefficient. There's huge amounts of money we can make for Americans. So I think all we got to do is get after it.
Yeah. Richard.
My hopeful note is that I think this next generation of CEOs has gotten the message. And I'm going to give you two examples. One is one that may surprise you. Oscar Muniz of United. Now, I know United had a certain problem a couple of weeks ago. However, his understanding of the airline business, fundamentally different from his predecessors. Make the unions well paid enough so that they feel like every flight is well done and improve our rankings. And they've gone from 8th to 3rd in customer service and baggage and things like this. Now, it's not a perfect story because of what happened with United, given a couple of weeks ago. But I just want to tell you that there's a appreciation on that score. Second is Howard Schultz, who you all know quite well from Starbucks, but this is a person who understood deeply, again, a new relationship with the workforce. When he came back in 2007 and went into coffee shops and the coffee wasn't good, and he was going, well, why is the coffee not good? You know, it's the same beans. Well, it's because they were quantifying the number of people served every hour as opposed to customer satisfaction with the coffee. And so it was the wrong way to look at it. It was through the wrong lens. And he said, okay, we're going to close all the stores for one day, and we're going to reteach people how to make coffee. And then it's going to be about making the coffee well each time, and then people will come back here, and they'll get sandwiches, and they'll be, you know, buying more things. And that was the essence of it. So my basic point is, it's an employee-driven understanding of being a CEO. You get this because that's what you do with your people, but it is that way as opposed to a Wall Street-driven way of doing it. And it's inside out. That's the hope for the future.
Questions? Right. Should we wait for a mic or no? Should I repeat it?
It's more for you, David. In the framework of who can you trust?
Yes. Now you've got a mic.
First of all, I agree with Richard, your points about trust. But the question is for David. Can you address, in the framework of who can you trust, the media's role, and also more specifically, what is your view on journalists, it's a fairly new phenomenon, as pundits?
So I think these are opposing ideas that I'm about to mention. So the first idea is that if we think of the crisis in trust in the media as distinct from these other crises in trust, we can't solve it. If we take a media-centric view of why trust in the media has dropped, and we forget about the fact that trust has also dropped in organized religion, big business, labor unions, politicians, I'm missing 3 or 4, then we'll be missing something, right? Because the odds that we can fix the media thing while all of these other things are still in crises of trust, I just think we're trying to solve the problem on too small a level. The problem with that is that it kind of lets us in the media off the hook, right? And so so we simultaneously, I think, cannot be naive about the fact that this is a broader problem than that. And we have to be rigorously self-critical about the problems in the media. So the one thing I would say is I don't think the pundit trend is actually that new. If you go back, John Dickerson, who's here, is the person who taught me this. If you go back and look at the nightly news from what we think of as the golden age of media, the anchors were more opinionated than they are today. The anchors back then were offering more opinions than Lester Holt is right now. And if you think about this, you will realize it's true, because remember when people say when was it the Nixon administration lost Walter Cronkite, they lost America? That was Walter Cronkite being a pundit, right? Which basically sort of doesn't happen now. So there's some parts of punditocracy that have increased and some that have decreased. I think the main way the media should be self-critical is touch on the issues that Richard talked about before. Are we covering the world as it really is, or are we covering the world as we think we see it? So I do think liberal bias is a problem, and I think we should be reflective about that. I don't think we should go so far that we do on the one hand, on the other hand, about climate change, right? The scientific facts are very clear about climate change. I do think elite bias is a problem in the media. Many people in the media now do quite well, right? And we are not sufficiently in touch with the experiences of many people in the country. And I think negative bias is a problem in the media. I think while we can't do stories saying the sun came up today, yay, we also have to think about the fact that sometimes we write about business and about government programs and about all kinds of things in ways that really focus on the negative and lose sight of the fact that 95% of a story might be positive. I'll tell you a brief thing about this, and then we'll get to other questions. I, as a reader, would be reading stories about Obamacare and the flaws in Obamacare, and I would ask myself a question. Is this a story that I could also read about Medicare? And if the answer was yes, I didn't take the story that seriously. You could go out and do 30 stories about all the problems in Medicare right now, but I think we would all agree that Medicare as a program, whatever its long-term problems, is functioning quite well month to month and year to year. If my answer was no, this isn't a story we could read about Medicare, then it made me think, actually, this may be about a problem with Obamacare that could undo it. So those are and I realize there's a real tension between those two ideas, but it's the only way I know how to think about it.
Look, I agree with what you said about the ability to express your opinion, but shouldn't media whether it be newsprint or television, divide between two things. The New York Times, its headline is all the news that fit to print. It's fine to have your opinions on the editorial page or the op-ed page, but at one of the sessions yesterday, they showed the New York Times and the Huffington Post so over, although the chart showed it to the right, it was really to the left, and then they showed the Post and the Fox News all the way on the other side of the equation. So it's fine if you want to say whatever you want to say on the editorial page, but shouldn't the front page and shouldn't the news section reflect the news, not the opinions of the journalists?
I'm going to make my co-panelists answer this question, and then I'll offer my own thoughts. What do you think is the right balance for news and opinion? You also just covered all the time. Do you like this model that we have in the United States, which, by the way, is historically unusual, in which we separate news and opinion?
First, I think having freedom of speech is, of course, one of our core values, and people should be able to say whatever they want to whomever they want. And you don't have to listen if you don't want to. I do think there's a liberal bias in the media, and I'm not way left, but I'm left anyway. But I still think there's a liberal bias here, and I think media sort of hasn't really addressed it. You talk about it, but you don't really do anything about it.
Yeah.
So could you separate it? It's always hard. Like you look at any given situation, and everybody's got a different view. And so there's a story. When the Pope was in Cuba, he was going down the Pope-mobile, and he was that hat, and the hat blew out into the water. Castro said, Your Holiness, let's stop. I'll go get your hat. So Castro gets out of the Pope-mobile, climbs out top, walks across the water, gets the hat, comes back. And so the Cuban paper says, Castro walks on water. The Vatican paper says that Pope performs miracle. Castro walks on water. The U.S. newspaper says Castro can't swim. So, I think it all just depends how you look at it. I don't really, it's a hard job. Do I sometimes read a story and cringe because I think they took all the negatives out of it? Yes. I think my probably biggest complaint about the media is oftentimes the story is written before it comes to us. So by the time we get the story, they're looking for a quote. So we try to figure out what their angle is and either give a quote or don't give a quote. And so that's the part that bothers me is the compression of time, the pressure that the journalists are under. Like it shows up and we get 12 hours notice for something that 1 million people are going to read. I wish that part, because I think if we had a dialogue, I think maybe I could convince them that their headline wasn't right.
I would take that criticism. I think you were right. We too often do write it in advance. And the thing I would say back is that part of the reasons we sometimes do that is we find that the companies and the government agencies that we're writing about aren't actually interested in having an honest conversation. And so we have to kind of go in ready to be told that when the profits were down 10% the last year, it's because something happened that'll never happen again, right?
Again, it's lack of trust.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Ma'am. Sure. Quick, though, because I want to get more questions.
But why are the polls saying the trust in the media is so low by the public? I mean, it's down to 10, 15%. Don't the editors, Tom, at your paper and other paper, how do they react to that?
We don't like those numbers. But again, I would really focus on it, which is, why is trust in organized religion down? Why is trust in big business down, right? I think trust in the media is down for a variety of reasons. I think we live in a highly polarized country. I think we in the media have made mistakes. And I think what happens is these things interact. It's not just, we all are here sort of talking about certain kinds of media, of which the New York Times is obviously one, that skew one way. Right? Obviously, talk show skews the other way completely, right? Conservative views don't have lack of access to the media when you combine Fox News and sort of talk radio and stuff like that. And so media has become highly polarized. I just don't know how to think about these numbers. If you look at Richard's numbers, if you look at the Gallup numbers, if you look at the Pew numbers, they all show the same things, which is trust in every major American institution is plummeting, with the exception of the military. And so to try to pull the media out of that, to me, just doesn't feel like it's where the fundamental answer likely lies.
I'd be interested, as in this time of activist investors, where they can, who want to maximize profits, where they can both get seats on the board and can even fire management. How is it that a company, if they are going to start to focus on the social good or on the larger community good that they can do, how will they be able to manage that in the face of this particular phenomenon of the activist investor?
I'll give you my answer, and then maybe Richard has some example from Unilever since you're involved. My answer is, you gotta make sure you're meeting all the objectives. Like, you cannot fall short on making money. You don't have to necessarily maximize profit, but you gotta get over the hurdle rate. You gotta show them you can make money, and you gotta show them you can grow. Then if you do the other things, you get credit for that. So but I think to the extent a business doesn't perform, you could make a pretty good argument that there's a role for activists, and people do that. If a business has got management that's not focusing and not changing, then maybe they should go. I'm not against all activists. I'm just I would like to see the debate be broader. Completely agree you got to make money, but I think business has to hold ourselves accountable for a broader purpose in society. And I think the way Richard said it resonated with me. You got to measure us differently.
Tom, can I ask you one question? You used the Unilever example before. If someone came to you and said, yeah, it's great that you're getting 11%, but you could get 12 if only you stopped caring about these other things, what would be your answer to them?
You got to make an answer for the future. You got to say, look, our growth is going to depend on us making an investment in local brands, for example, in the food business. We're not going to be able to do it on margarine, and because people aren't going to buy it. So let us grow a whole bunch of smaller brands. I mean, show the business case for, and the local brands can be sourced differently and promoted differently. You got to give them a story.
You have to tell the whole story, but I also think that people have to want to listen to the whole story.
Yeah.
And I think that's a hurdle we need to get across yet with business. I think business needs to take accountability for employment in America. I agree. It's not a government problem. Like, the government, they probably employ too many people right now, but we could employ more, and we need to figure out how to do that. But I don't think we should do that by giving our money away, our shareholders' money away. We got to figure out how to, and that's what we get paid to do. So it's just about doing your job.
Yeah. Yep, it's coming.
How about the role of practically unlimited money, especially corporate money, in lobbying after Citizens United? I think that contributes a lot to lack of trust, both corporations, government, media. Thank you.
I mean, we're regulated in 50 states, so we see. And we're not that heavily regulated at the federal level, but so we see, the money pouring into politics. I think the whole, just personally for public companies, if you look at how much public corporations give to the political process, isn't really not that much money relative to private corporations. If you look at what unions give in either direct dollars or what they call member education, called phone banks, reaching out to people. There's a bunch of money in politics, and it's not just business. And so, somebody ought to really have a dialogue about, like, I forget how much. I think the unions were in for a couple of billion on Obama at the last election. I don't know what they were for the Clinton campaign, but there's a lot of money in politics. I think there's too much money in politics, but I don't think it's just businesses, and I don't think it's just Citizens United that suddenly the Supreme Court said that, and companies like us and everybody else is saying, great, here's $50 million or $100 million. I mean, we got to make our numbers. So we don't. It's not really coming from public corporations.
One of the most fascinating statistics I read recently was, I don't know if they did the research, but it was in a book by Kay Schlossman and Sidney Verba that looked at public opinion by income and where policy tended to go. And the opinion of the great mass of the American people has relatively little relationship with where government policy goes. Changes in opinion at the very top are hugely impactful on government policy. And the most interesting way to think about this recently is think about what happened to elite opinion on same-sex marriage, right? It flipped, and policy flipped relatively quickly after that. And I think there's a pretty tight relationship to your question about that. The thing that I wish we had, if we're going to have this money in politics, is I really do think we need disclosure. I think people need the right to know who's doing this. There's a really fair debate about what money is speech and what money is not speech. I don't know the answer to that debate, but I do think people should have a right to know who's doing it. I hate saying this because I see more hands up, but I've gotten the 0 minutes remaining sign. So I want to thank you all very much for coming. Please thank Tom and Richard for me.